ask questions during your talk?
It's better if you do.
Yes, thank you very much. So
I prefer if you interrupt me and ask questions if you don't understand something. Otherwise, you can get lost too early on in the talk, and that's suboptimal.
And final remark before I turn to you. Usually we run seminar during 45 or 50 minutes, and then I ask about need for break. Okay. If there will be some need to have a short break, we will have 5 minutes break after 40 or 50 minutes. Is it okay for you?
That's great. So before questions, you have a break, basically.
Okay. So please start.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, Nikolai. So indeed, so it was about 8 years ago, I think, that we were co-located in Kazakhstan. And there were a limited number of people doing theoretical computer science, although we were in different cities. We managed to link up to compensate for that. So it's nice to see Nikolai again. And as Nikolai said, I did visit Innopolis when PSI was located there. So I saw it as a building site with one or two buildings. There was a canteen, and there was a big building connected to the canteen. And apart from that, I think the rest was still under construction. So it's good to hear that the university is going the right direction. Okay, so this paper is, in fact, I haven't changed. I thought about changing it, but then I thought, actually, let's keep this. This was published a few years ago in LIX. So this is obviously one of the main venues for logic in the field of theoretical computer science. As Nikolai said, session types is maybe something that is known to a few people. I don't think I'll start from a session type perspective. Later on, I will connect with session types. Yes, sorry, I should be aware that indeed the audience is not familiar with so much with my native British English. I can slow down a little, no problem. So let's get going. Maybe an example will help us get going. Imagine you have the following situation. In a system or a distributed system, you have a number of entities who want to communicate with each other. So we have here what? We have some client A, who wants to communicate with the service A. And we have some, and you can see that they want to communicate because one is sending A and the other one is wanting to receive A. So this is a communication that can happen. And on the other hand, we have service B, which wants to talk to client B. And indeed, you can see that B, like sending B happens from the client and receiving B happens from the service. So this is in a rather abstract setting. So one could imagine that one could, these two services, because they don't interfere with each other at all, they can communicate happily forever with each other. Service A talking to client A forever, and at the same time, service B can talk to client B forever without any problems. Okay, that's a reasonable assumption here. So the automata suggests this is a loop here. And so one might want to ask the question, is it the case that everyone wishing to trade, this is an aliveness property, eventually does so? And one would intuitively say, yes, everyone wanting to do something can eventually do it. But there exists a path in the system, if we consider the infinite paths through the system, where client A sends something to service A, it sends A, because that's the message here, so this communication happens. And then at the next step, client A sends something to service A, that is A happens, and so on. So we can have this infinitely often path, a path along which infinitely often A is sent from client A to service A. This is a valid path of the system. And notice along that path, B never does anything. Okay, so you see a problem. Like intuitively, we say that these two things can continue communicating without any interruption. But if we ask this liveness property to hold for all paths, then there exists a path for which the liveness property clearly does not hold, because B does not perform any action along this infinite path. Okay, and therefore we say that this liveness property, let's say L, does not hold with respect to all paths, and we're going to say denote all paths by the letter P. Okay. Now, on the other hand, what happens is that we can introduce another notion of fairness, or a notion of fairness where we don't range over all paths when we're asserting a liveness property, and we consider only certain paths, and this is going to be this letter J, which I'll explain. And J is a notion of fairness called justness, which is a fairly minimal fairness property. And what it says that as long as nobody interrupts me, then I can do something, okay? And we can see that because A is never interrupting B, then, well, the communication A on this side here never interrupts the communication on this side, then eventually this communication between service B and client B will eventually happen. And indeed, because it will eventually happen in all parts of the path, all subsequences or subpaths, then it will happen, in fact, infinitely often. So, so basically, everyone will be happy if we make this assumption first, that we are ranging over all just paths and not just all paths. Okay, so we have now a little bit more satisfaction here. We're able to satisfy this liveness property for this very simple system, and that intuitively is correct. Okay. Now, what can happen is that one might consider another system which has a little bit more interaction going on. So it's pretty much the same. We have client A and service A, they want to communicate with each other, and client B and service B, they want to communicate with each other. And again, it's just A and B. So at that level, it looks pretty much the same as what we had before. But in the middle, we have a supplier who's providing some kind of data to the service. And the service says, I'm going to ask for D. And if I ask for D, then I will be ready to see B. And the supplier on the other side is going to say, oh yeah, I'm going to be able to respond to a request for C. And if the service does provide that C, then it is ready to do the interaction. So there's an extra step that happens before A and B do anything. And both of them are dependent on some third party, let's say, like a supplier. Okay. Now the question is, does this liveness property that we discussed before hold? So does everyone wishing to trade eventually do so? So this could be already something that you could respond to me with if you wish. There's no obligation to do so. But is it the case that everyone wishing to trade in this setting eventually does so? So will client B will always be able to do something eventually? Will client A always be able to do something eventually? And again, of course, this depends on your assumptions. So I can give you a just path. Remember, justness was this idea that if if an interaction is not interrupted, then it will eventually happen. And here we have a just path. So the supplier and service A interact. Okay, that's the first step. Then, because the service is now in this state, in fact, I should have moved the little dot. Then the client and the service can interact. Okay. And then what's going on? I go back to do the same. The supplier and the service interacts, and then the client and the service interact and so on. And this can happen infinitely often. So clearly that's a path, but why is it a just path? It's because this interaction, although there was an interaction available between the supplier and the service, it is interrupted infinitely often by the interaction on the other side, this one here, involving C. And therefore it is a valid path. Yep, so there's no action along this path where only the supplier, service, and client, service A and client A act. So along that path, it satisfies justness, and furthermore, these entities never perform any action. Okay, so with respect to justness, this liveness property does not hold. Okay, but if we make a stronger fairness assumption still, so we really need to understand the fairness assumptions for this talk, as you can see, then it's the case that in fact we can make this satisfy our liveness property. And this what I'm using the letters here, SC, and this stands for strong fairness of components. Okay, strong fairness of components means that if a component, say service B, in this example, is infinitely often able to do an action. So enabled to do an action doesn't necessarily mean you can do it. So there is a state clearly where the service B can do this interaction with the supplier. And the question is, does the supplier eventually do it? And according to strong fairness of components, it does, because service B is infinitely often able to do something, and therefore it will eventually take that option. Okay, that option will eventually be taken. So we will rule out this path, which is not ruled out by this weaker notion of fairness called justness. Okay. Going on a little bit, so one might say, well, we could assume a strong fairness of components then, if we want more liveness, but we can come up with further examples where fairness is going to impact this. And you notice that each of these examples is almost the same. We have still a client in the service, a client in the service. They're communicating only in one way. They're sending A, they're sending B, respectively. Okay. And in the middle now, we have a slightly different third party, and it's a supplier. And it's still a supplier which interacts with the services. Okay, so still interacting with the services in pretty much the same way as the previous example. But there's one important difference here, is when the supplier is in this state, it can choose between making a tau transition as an internal choice to end up in a state where it can only do one of the particular outputs, or it can take this transition where it can only perform the other output, this is C and D. Whereas the previous example, remember, it could always choose to do either of the actions C or D, or interact on the actions C or D. Now, why is this important? We'll see this. Well, we ask the same question again. Is it the case that everyone wishing to trade eventually does so in this example? And again, you have the right to interrupt me and give me an answer to that question. Do you believe that is the case? And of course, you could anticipate the answer. The answer is, depends on your fairness assumption. So to see this, it's probably best to look at the path. So here is a path that is strongly fair with respect to components. So it satisfies this SC condition that I described earlier. Okay. So firstly, what we do is we perform a transition, a tau transition, to reach a state. So the supplier can perform some action, which is a tau transition, so it does. Okay. It reaches a state where then it is ready to perform some output. But notice it is not prepared now to actually perform any interaction on D. Okay. And once it's reached this state, it can indeed perform this interaction over here. So we can basically send C from the supplier to the service. Okay, we can see this. We can perform this interaction. Okay. In the meantime, the service has now reached this state. So this interaction is now enabled. So we can do this interaction. Yeah. And what else can happen? Well, service A is now back in the state it started. So client A only had one state, so it's back in its original state. And furthermore, the supplier is back in its original state. So we're back to the beginning. But service B, again, has been starved of performing any interaction. Now, why was a service B starved here? Even if we assume the fairness of components, it's because there was never an opportunity for service B to do anything along this path. Because look at the next step again, I do this tau transition, I take the same tau transition, so the supplier is happy because it did something, okay? And only the interaction with service A is enabled. At no point do I reach a state where an interaction with service B is enabled, okay? I can keep on going forever around this loop. And therefore I have a path which guarantees strong fairness of the components in the system, which is a really common notion that you'll find like from the early days in the 70s when people started studying liveness. It's one of the most ubiquitous notions. There is this path that satisfies strong fairness of components, but does not satisfy this liveness property because client B never does anything, nor does service B, by the way. Okay? So we don't satisfy this condition, liveness with respect to strong fairness of components. We do, however, satisfy a still stronger condition, which is strong fairness with respect to the transitions. And why is this? Because remember, the supplier at this point had a choice between performing this transition and this transition here. There were two transitions enabled. And if we now push the fairness notion right down to the level of transitions, not to the level of components, and we say that if a transition is infinitely often enabled, it will eventually be taken, then, of course, because we reached this state here with the markers in red, we reached this state here infinitely often, and this is infinitely often, this enabled this transition, because in the state it has always enabled this tau transition, then we know that eventually we will take this tau transition and end up in this state. Therefore, this interaction with D will eventually be enabled, and therefore these two components can communicate. And therefore, by justness, even we would have that these two things can communicate. Okay? So you can see here this progression. Firstly, I started with no fairness assumption, other than that paths are infinite, so you don't just stop in the middle of a path, you go on forever if possible. Then we looked at justness, which was a minimal condition, which is if I'm not interrupted, then I will eventually do something. Then the notion after that was the strong fairness of components, which was that if a component is infinitely often enabled to do something, then it will eventually do something. And then the strongest one we considered at the end is if a particular transition is infinitely often enabled, then I'll eventually do something. So it's a really subtle notion here. You can see this. One might ask whether that's those are all the notions we need. The answer is no. There are, I think, about 50 different distinct notions of fairness, okay, some of which are depicted in the slide. And the notions here, why it's 50 or something rather than the number, whatever is on the slide, is because already what we've done here is we've crunched down the space of possible transition of notions of fairness to consider only notions of fairness which are relevant for finite state automata. If you look at infinite state systems, then you have a larger number of fairness notions. And at the top, you can see the strong notion, this notion of strong fairness of transitions. This is the last one we covered, is the strongest possible one you can make. Right at the bottom, you have this notion P, which is I range over all paths, which is the weakest one. And in between, we have other notions such as this justness and strong fairness of components that I've emphasized. Okay. And this is okay for just now. You can forget this.
So just to make clear, S in this diagram always stays for strong, I believe, right?
In this diagram, no. So if it has S in front, then it's strong, the notion of fairness.
Yes, but S always stays for strong. Is it correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I may be mishearing it.
Well, I am looking on this diagram.
Yes.
It has a lot of acronyms, and I do believe that every time S is something like strong, but W is always should be something like weak. Is it correct?
Yes, precisely. And J is just, which is something
Just,
like
okay. Just to understand this diagram, but
yes.
not in this case is SWI. What is SWI?
Oh, that's the most difficult one to answer. I could pick another one.
Okay.
But say SA is strong fairness of actions, SZ is strong fairness of synchronizations and communications. SI is the strong fairness of instructions, which is really subjective. It depends on your calculus. This is strong fairness of groups of transitions, groups of components. This is strong fairness of components individually. This is something weird. The SWI is something strange. So each of these does have an established notion, and for most of these notions, you'll see that there is a weak counterpart. Yeah, so in the weak setting down here, you'll find the same symbols appearing. So there is a kind of a way of constructing these things, and this was done largely by my co-authors. They have a large survey paper by Rob van Glabbeek and Peter Höfner. I saw this paper and said, like, let's apply it to session types because it looks like there's a strong connection here. It's important. What they did is they basically surveyed every single notion of fairness they could find in the literature and tried to classify them by naming convention, as Nikolai's pointed out, and also classify them by how they relate to each other, which turned out to be non-trivial, as you can see. And you can see that some of these arrows, some of these relations are dependent on conditions on the side. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. It says that, well, if 2 and 3 holds, then there's this arrow. But if they don't hold, then that's a different story. So it's not even as simple as this. It turns out to be that this idea of being fair in your choices you make turns out to be something extremely subtle. Coming back again to this notion of session types a little bit, I want to ask, can I make this a little bit simpler for you? The answer is yes, thankfully. If I restrict to session calculi, now session calculi are not arbitrary finite state automata even, they're communicating automata. They have a specific form. So in a session calculus, I can have something of this form typically. There are different notations, but the notations are not so important because I'll try and be diagrammatic with this in this talk exclusively. So this kind of a notation says that I send something lambda I is the action I want to take, the name of the action, or the type of the action, and pi is to whom I want to send it to, and ti is what I do afterwards, so it's the continuation afterwards. And this is an internal choice, which means I, as a sender, I choose what I want to send, okay? And that's what these tau transitions are modeling. If I'm in this state, then I'm essentially allowed to make a choice. I'm going to commit to doing lambda 2. So I move to the state where I've committed that I'm going to send lambda 2. I'm only wanting to send lambda 2, and then I submit it. I'm ready to interact with anyone who is ready to receive lambda 2, okay? And then afterwards, I continue as T2. So you can see that this pattern here, that there is this internal choice between outputs, which is modeled by moving to a state where I've made the choice internally, okay? On the other hand, when you're receiving information, you don't know what you're going to receive a priori. You don't make the choice, you wait till someone sends something to you, and when someone sends it to you, you react to what they send. That's a typical setup. So I think it's a realistic assumption to distinguish between the choices you make when you send things and when you receive things. And what's happened here is that I can be in a state where I can make a choice between receiving a number of actions, and then depending what I receive, I continue in a number of ways. That's what this notation means. So this is an external choice between inputs. And in this state, indeed, I'll answer that question in 30 seconds. Okay. If I'm in this state, then I can make a transition that corresponds to the one over here. But if this tau transition had been taken instead of this one, then I would still be able to respond to like this interaction here from the state. So I haven't committed to what I'm going to do yet. And the question that I have from Alexander is that is there really a notion of choice for tau transitions? And the answer is yes, of course. I can, but the question is who chooses. So you have to really think about the kind of strategies you're allowed depending on your application. So in general, for a process calculus, there are many notions of choice for tau transitions. And what's happening here is because typically we're ranging over all ways in which we can execute the system without controlling choices, the choices are not made by anyone interacting with the system. If the choice is a tau transition, because the component can move from one state to the other without any intervention from anyone else. Okay, so that means that you're basically ranging over all possible ways in which, when you range over all traces, you're ranging over all possible ways in which you can resolve this particular choice of what I'm going to send. So I don't know whether this fully answers your question. Probably not, but you can always unmute and ask further questions.
Alexander, are you happy with the answer, Alexander? Okay, he has a right to unmute.
I will continue in the chat, okay?
Great, okay, and I can always pick up things at the end as well if necessary. But the notion of choice is something which is a multifaceted question. like you, and exactly, fairness is trying to resolve this kind of things. What is a session here?
The question was really, can the machine itself really control? So it emits some some symbol like tau, and
yes.
can it really have control over where it goes? So here we have a non-determinism. So
okay, so basically it depends what this models, doesn't it? So typically, if what could it model? It could model a number of things, and depending what it models, it will impact how the choice is made and how you constrain choices, and therefore your notion of fairness. So if it's modeling, for instance, a user, and basically sending is like you have a button and you say I want to send A or I want to send B, then I mean, one of these entities could be this, and then indeed you can make that choice, and there's no guarantee that you are fair, because I could always, like if I have a phone book, I could always phone the same two people over and over, and I'm not obliged to phone everyone in my phone book. So a person is not obliged to be fair necessarily. But if the choice is coming from some probabilistic event that is reasonably distributed, then eventually one of these choices will be made. So it really depends what is behind the choice. Is it coming from like some physical process that you're observing that you guarantee to like move in a predictable way, that it's such that eventually everything will be covered? Then there's this distribution over the choice even, and this impacts then how you model the choice. So it really is, it depends on the specific context in which you're applying the session types. There's no one interpretation or one application of session types. So I have another question here, which is what is the session here? Maybe if I go to the next iteration of the slides, then I can look here. So of course I haven't introduced session types really. I'm introducing session calculi rather than session types. That's a session is basically a communication where you want to achieve something, okay? So if you want to, like, I don't know, if you want to connect a website, for instance, you start a session with it's a TCP session with the the web server, and then you go and you click around the website, and you get some pages, and then you get you close your session at the end. So this notion of session you'll see all the time. So like there's this idea that at the start we connect to each other. So there's a client, there's a service, there's a supplier, and not everyone needs to connect to everyone. Those who need to, but they're aware that there's a session in which something is going to happen, and they want to say that, well, inside that session, I know that other people in the session are going to do the following things if the protocol is followed. So the notion of session is like there's something like where we've defined, like, and here's an example here. I have a client A, service A, supplier, service B, client B. Basically, this is just a syntactic representation of what you've seen previously. And they do the following things locally, but together they are completing a session between each other, okay? So this is a multi-party session. Okay. I hope this clarifies what the session is. This is really just a syntactic representation of something you've seen before. If we control over the taus, what's the point of having them in the first place? But who's we? That's the question. So who has control? Because remember, there are different actors in the system. There's the machine who's running. If they control the taus, that's fine. Yes, but okay. You don't want to have the following situation where it looks like the receiver of the message is going to is making the choice. So if, for instance, there is a choice between lambda 1 and lambda 2 in this example here, so we have lambda 1 and lambda 2 here. If we have the choice, if we don't have this tau transition in between, then the receiver can make the choice. So it's a bit like I send two messages, and you then choose which one which you want to actually use, and you throw the other one away. And that's kind of what it models. If the person receiving something can make that decision, but in reality they can't. It is not an accurate model of how most systems operate. So it's really forcing a notion of who is making the choice. Like, otherwise it looks like it could be either party, and this really impacts the analysis of sessions. Like, who makes a choice is critical. We may see this actually from examples coming up. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. So as we saw previously, there's this wide notion of fairnesses, which are for the finite state systems, which are relevant to us, finite state communicating automata. And if we, however, restrict to these session calculi, initiations, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure that I follow that question about notation, but it's not important because I'm not going to use notation. I'm going to use graphics from now on. Okay, so there are numerous syntaxes for session calculi. Right. So, but if I now restrict to session calculi, where basically the sender is really explicitly making the choice, is deciding what is going to be sent, then I actually simplify this picture. So we have this large figure containing many notions of fairness, and we see that all these notions in red, for instance, actually collapse with each other. They all become the same thing if we restrict to session calculi, where inputs and outputs are of this particular form. So session types seem to drastically reduce the notions of fairness which are relevant. So this is another reason why it might be appealing to restrict in this way. And you can see these blue notions on up here, they all collapse. Also, these two notions here, they've collapsed. All of these green notions down the bottom, they've collapsed into some point, and there's a few left over. Okay, I haven't explained what they are, but they're not important, as you'll see. So if I restrict the calculus somewhat, if I restrict, instead of looking at arbitrary communicating automata, and I instead look at the session calculi, then there are only a certain number of notions of fairness which are actually relevant. Okay, So we've managed to now home down this picture to look like this. This is a diagram from previously. And it so happens that we can reduce this diagram even further to say what are the notions of fairness which are relevant to session types. And we can do so by saying, we're not just interested in the notion of fairness here. We were also interested in a liveness property. Remember from the beginning, it was like everyone who wants to trade eventually will do so. That's a liveness property. And that gives you an intuition for this notion of lock-freedom, which we have here, which is also a liveness property, which says essentially the following. So it's live according to some particular notion of fairness F, if along any fair path, according to the notion F, because now we've seen there are many notions of fairness. So I have take all paths of the system and I restrict to only the paths which are allowed according to the notion of fairness. So if I take any of those paths, then if any component that has not successfully terminated, it hasn't reached a state which says, okay, I'm done and I've done everything I wanted to do, then it must eventually perform some action. Okay. This is lock freedom. So basically anyone who wants to do something is not starved of the right to do so. Okay. This is related to a number of notions that you'll see in distributed computing, and it's strictly stronger than deadlock freedom, for instance, which only requires that the system as a whole is busy. While as you'll notice here that this is requiring that all components in the system are busy as they want to be. Okay, so if we restrict now to notions of lock freedom with respect to notions of fairness, we reduce the space considerably again. So just note that have a little 30-second pause while I try and find the charger here. The charger I'm using is working. It's switched. That's easy to do. Okay. If we now consider not just notions of fairness, we now consider of a particular notion of liveness, lock freedom, with respect to the different notions of fairness. We're fixing our notion of liveness now. Then we considerably reduce our space again, as you can see. And you can see that all of these notions down the side here, these ones here, have collapsed. And these two notions at the top, which was strong fairness of transitions and strong fairness of interactions, have collapsed. And all of these are stronger than deadlock freedom, as I said in just a minute. So now from that incredibly complicated diagram where we had 50 notions even before we started, and now we've identified that precisely out of all the notions that have been considered in the past, only 4 notions are relevant at all in any sense to session types when we are considering specifically the notion of lock freedom. Okay, so we had this feeling that somehow because session types are supposed to guarantee some kind of liveness property, we had this feeling, and liveness is somehow sensitive to different notions of fairness. We had this idea that fairness was somehow important, but the space of fairness properties seems dauntingly huge. But in fact, those that are relevant we can prove, and this has all been proven, are precisely the 4 notions of fairness here. Okay, so this is a really analytic way of crunching down your search space for the problem. Okay, but what is the problem? Okay, now we come to proper session types, I think. Yes, this is just a note, by the way. Sorry, this slide is saying, notice that P was in the bottom here and ST is at the top here, whereas it's the other way around on the other side. So ST is at the top. Yeah. P is at the bottom, but the arrows are the other way around. You see this? Okay, if you have something that's a trace that satisfies this, then you have a trace that satisfies this, and so on. But on the other hand, the arrow is in the other way when it comes to the liveness property. And why is this? Is because if you are restricting the number of traces, which is what's happening going up here, you're restricting the number of traces, then there's more chance that your liveness property holds, because you're being less demanding of the liveness property. And that's why it works like this. There's a contravariance here between the fairness notion and the liveness property. This is natural. And it happens that if you know session types, there's a line of work by Padavani considering fair notions of lock freedom, and this coincides with the top. So he's looking at the top of the spectrum, the one which verifies, and at the top here, this verifies the most systems. This verifies the least systems, and these two are something in between. Okay, but what are the advantages and then disadvantages of these different notions? This is a natural thing to ask. So let's return to our examples, and we will see. Now we have this knowledge about justness and why it's important. We see what they are. We see that only the four that I gave you at the beginning are in fact important. How does this play out when it comes to session types? Okay, so we have here an example of a system. We have exactly the system before. We have client and the service interacting with each other. We're starting with our simplest example again. And we have the service B, and they interact with each other. Okay, and there's no interference between them. So you expect that this is a good system. So we would hope the session types could type this and say that, yes, this is a good session. Let's go with this one. And indeed, I can draw a session type system or a session type, a global session type, which is basically one of these diagrams. It's like a message sequence chart. And what it does is it sends the message A from client A to service A, and then it sends the message B from client B to service B. And the fact that one is after the other is irrelevant. It's just that syntactically they happen after each other, as suggested by this diagram. And then afterwards, I hit this recursion X, which allows me to loop back and do it over and over again. Okay. And what we do in session types is we take this global type here, and we look at each of the individual components, say just the client, and we say, well, what does it do along this path? So the client A, client B, what does it do? Well, if I look down, what it does is it sends B. Yes, it sends a message B, and then it goes back and it loops forever. Okay, and this looks pretty much exactly like this automaton that you're seeing here. This client B is just looping forever, just sending message B, and this is called the projection. So I can project each of these entities. So I can take the projection of client B, which is the automaton here, you can see here, and I can ask whether if I take this this global type and I perform some operator which gives me the local session type for that operator. So there's basically a function that does this. For client B, give me the local type. For service A, give me the local type. And if I can check my automaton against this, so that's what this this notation is suggesting, then I know that the system is well typed if I can do so for each of the automaton in my system. Okay. And indeed, if we notice here that we get something here which is which matches, so this holds, that's good. Like there's a system for checking that. It's fairly straightforward because it's almost just the isomorphism of the two. And if we notice, in addition, before we do some recursion, before we get to X and go back to the beginning, something happens, which means that this is this particular projection of the global type is guarded. And if we have these two conditions, if basically this entailment holds and the system is guarded, and we have this for all of the entities in the system, then this is our criterion for checking, for concluding that this our system is well typed with respect to this particular global session type. Okay. So this is good. So we have is well typed. And because this example, remember the very first slide, I said that this does not satisfy lock freedom with respect to all paths. That means that considering all paths is clearly unsound with respect to typability. Okay, this is a counterexample to that. So LP is not a good notion. So remember, we had these four notions, one at the bottom, one at the top. LP is not good. It's throwing out too many systems. Okay, it should be able to type this one, but if we were targeting LP, that would not be the case. So LP is bad. This is what this example shows. So we're down to three candidate notions. Okay, so we're going a little bit slower than I expected, because that's fine, because we have a little chat. What about this notion here? Okay, so we have now another example we've seen before. We have the supplier in the middle, and remember we have these tau transitions, which you asked a good deal of questions about. It's a good way to model the fact that someone specifically commits to making one of their choices. It's the sender that's committing. And we have a global session type for this. And if we can project again the client here, client B, on the session type, then what I do is I go down here and I see what it does. Well, there's two branches here. There's a choice made by the supplier. In this branch, it does nothing, and then goes back to the beginning. Okay. And in the other choice, which is down here, it does something. It sends a B and then goes back to the beginning. Okay. So if I take the projection of client B in this instance, which should type the same automata, and it does, in fact, this is in fact typable. That's not the issue here. We get something, however, that is not guarded, in the sense that on one of the branches, I don't do anything. Okay. And the session type system will throw this out. If you look at our paper, you will see that this is not typable according to the session type system, because the projection is not guarded. Okay, that's bad. Okay, and remember though, however, if you can remember from earlier in the talk, I said that in fact this particular example satisfies lock freedom with respect to strong fairness of transitions, which was at the top of the picture, and that means the strong fairness of transitions must be incomplete with respect to typability. So I've thrown it out. It's not a good match for session type systems if we want soundness and completeness, for instance, if that was our target. If we want soundness, it's okay. If we want soundness and completeness, it's not the right notion that we're targeting. So we're trying to find out what notion of lock freedom with respect to what notion of fairness do session types guarantee. Okay, this was not previously 100% known. Okay, so we're clarifying this. So we have these notions here. We've ruled out this. This is incomplete. This one down here is unsound. That's even worse. We definitely can't have this. And we're left with these two notions in the middle. And it turns out that we restrict ourselves furthermore to race-free sessions, and even these two notions in the middle collapse. So for race-free session couplers, sessions where you don't have a situation where I don't know what's going to happen because it depends who gets to me first. I'm listening to two parties, and whoever shouts first, I will respond to them. That's a session with a race. If it doesn't have such a situation, then it is race-free. Okay. So therefore, to some extent, for race-free session calculi, we've solved the problem. We have this notion in the middle. It's a unique notion of lock freedom. Okay. And in fact, there's a theorem saying that.
Ross, sorry.
Yes.
It is already 15 minutes after your start. Mind to have a break.
Yes. Should I just summarize a slide? And
yes, of course. It is just my role as a moderator. Don't worry. Please
absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, you're right. I think that's correct. But let me just finish this slide, and then it will just take me 30 seconds to do that. And there's something to take into account here. That the theorem, therefore, that I'm summarizing diagrammatically here is that if you have a well-typed system according to session types and it's race-free, then you know that the network, this is N is a network here, is going to be satisfy this liveness property lock freedom with respect to justness. This is independently of, this works in both cases. Okay, so we're getting this tight correspondence between typability and a particular notion of liveness, parameterized unfairness that we're trying to go for. And indeed, the opposite direction also holds, but with slightly different conditions, because race freedom is not required in the other direction. So any notion, network which satisfies our liveness property that we uncover, we can always construct a global session type, which is going to be, in fact, typeable with respect to the network concerned. So we get this completeness result, which was did not exist previously in the literature. This is a key contribution here. So we take, is it a 10-minute pause, you said? Or?
Yes. So let's have 5 minutes break. Okay?
Great, okay, 5 minutes break.
5 minutes break. Skype still is on, so people can chat, can communicate, but I'm going for another cup of coffee.
Okay. Great, so we'll have a little pause now. I'll get some water.
So we may and can continue. There are some questions already. in the chat, by the way. Maybe it makes sense to answer the question right now, Ross.
Yes, it does. So there's a question in the chat. Should I answer that one?
Maybe.
For the moderator. Essentially, this completeness result is the main theorem. You will see just that there are further. There's one further example. I can go back and explain a richer example if anyone wants to. We've largely concluded already. So we could go straight to questions at this point. It's possible.
I believe some questions are immediate questions. So, for example, the most recent, both soundness and completeness raises a question: what are the restrictions under which this calculus works? For example, does it only apply to the client server model, for example?
Yes, so absolutely, it doesn't only apply to the client server model in some sense, but it may be that you mean something different from what I'm about to say. In the sense that you notice for all of these examples, there are multiple parties. There's not just one party communicating with another party, like a client and a server. We had 5 entities typically in these systems, and in fact, it could be as many entities as you like. So these are multi-party sessions and modeling other complex distributed systems other than the client-server interactions. And if you were to restrict to client-server interactions, where there's exactly one client communicating with exactly one server, then lock freedom is not the issue, it's just deadlock freedom, because there isn't really any notion of, there isn't any possibility that someone can be starved in the system. If the whole system deadlocks and there's only 2 people, then you have a disaster anyway. So we've got starvation. So it doesn't. These questions are only relevant if you have 3 or more parties. But I think there was a clarification that came through. Is that right?
At least it sounds like this. Alexander continues his question. To paraphrase, under what circumstances this calculus will not work?
Yes, and this is an excellent question, in that there is a boundary here. So maybe what I after having paused, I could maybe go back to the slide that we were on previously. Now, notice here I've made an assumption, which is this race freedom, and somehow that makes everything dead easy, and everything that was good is in fact the same thing. Well-typedness is the same as lock freedom with respect to strong fairness of components. It's the same as lock freedom with respect to justness. Okay, so you have this this really tight correspondence, soundness and completeness. However, what's interesting is what happens in between, because the situation is not so simple for on the other side, when we don't have this assumption of race freedom, and maybe we want to consider sessions which are not race free, but still we want to type them. Races are something that can happen in real systems, and it might be that the race is benign. It might be that 2 things can arrive at different times, and you have a way to handle both of them, but both ways you handle them are both good in some sense. They both satisfy the Leibniz property. So the picture for the more general picture is a bit more like this, that you have, if you don't have race freedom, then we know that if you have something that's lock-free, then it's well-typed. That's a completeness result. Okay, but you don't have the other direction, that if it's well-typed, then you guarantee anything. Notice there's no arrow going up whatsoever, not even to deadlock freedom. Okay, if you don't have race freedom. And the key question here is, if race freedom is good, but still too strong, is there a notion in between race freedom and no assumption at all in terms of the calculus, which allows you to recover some arrow going in this way in general? So can you get, like for instance, some implication, like if that well-typedness implies lock freedom with respect to strong fairness of components? or even you get an equivalence back, that you get an implication in this direction as well. Okay, so basically soundness, if you've typed something, it doesn't mean it's you've guaranteed anything in terms of liveness, or even deadlock freedom, according to session type systems. If you have this setting where you are allowed to, there's a proviso here that we're looking at a more general setting than some session type systems which do have this property, which is we can send to multiple different parties. We're not obliged to make a choice between sending two different messages to the same party. We can send messages to different parties. Just that one extension requires us to work out a little bit harder. And I say this is a partly open problem. It has partly been addressed already in recent work, in that people are looking, there's a guy, Felix Stutz, he's about to graduate in his PhD, and I had a conversation with him just 30 minutes before this talk. There's some other authors in Italy who've come up with a notion of basically looking at the messages which are available at a particular time, and somehow if you look at you keep track of this set of available messages, then you can allow some processes with races to happen as long as it's certain conditions hold. These conditions are maybe a little bit too complicated to wave about. So there exists a middle ground. Already we know there is a middle ground, but is that middle ground optimal? Are there better ways of doing this? This is very much one of the open questions in this area. So write to me if you have any thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. So let's continue. So no more immediate questions, we can continue. Mm-hmm.
So we can continue with the talk.
Yes, yeah. Yes, exactly. No more immediate questions. Okay, please continue.
Right. Okay. So basically, what I've done is I've explained these slides. I could explain now this slide. So one might say, well, okay, we have this picture where we have we have completeness in the sense that any property, any network, satisfying the property that it is lock-free with respect to all just traces. That's what this notation means here. Then we know it's well-typed. And remember, well-typed means we can construct these global session types. So it's quite a useful property in itself. Like if I can model check basically directly the liveness property, then I know I can synthesize a global session type, which is like a global picture of like what everyone does. Like it's not just the local view. The network is, remember, the local automata, but what's the global picture? And we can always do this when it's lock-free with respect to justness, but not anything else, only justness. And one might say, well, why only just this? They say, well, can we not have an arrow from here to here? From lock freedom with respect to strong fairness of components to well-typedness. Is it possible to strengthen this result? And one would hope that would be the case, because strong fairness of components is the most widely studied notion of fairness, perhaps, in the literature, and justness is relatively understudied. The answer is no. And that's what the following example is going to present. Okay, consider the following system. So we have 3 automata here. They're all communicating with each other as before. We have sending and receiving. We have, for instance, on the left, we have a seller who makes the choice about what they're going to send, A or B. And of course, that choice is done by a tau transition. As we've said, we're restricting to session calculi, where if there's a choice of sending, then we make a commitment to what we're going to send, okay? And we don't allow the receiver to influence that choice, like the sender commits to that. And we have a buyer over here who can interact with A, which is one of the 2 possible choices, A or B here on the left. So it can interact with A as often as it likes. But then in order to move to a state where it can receive B, which is the other choice that the seller can make, it needs to consult a regulator. And the regulator says, okay, you can move from this state to the next state by performing this action C, okay? And then it's a completely symmetric problem. So like once we're in this state, we need to ask the regulator to go back in order to be able to buy product A again, if we want to make that choice. So there's some regulation happening. There's some external party which is determining what the buyer can receive, okay, from the seller. So the seller just is simple. It's just saying, I want to sell this, I want to sell that. The buyer is saying, well, I'm willing to send this, I'm willing to buy this, but I'm only allowed to do this currently, and I have to consult with the regulator first before I can buy the other thing, if you ever want to switch choices. And now this is a separating example between lock freedom with respect to justness and lock freedom with respect to strong fairness of components. It doesn't satisfy lock freedom with respect to justness. Why? Well, there is the following just trace. There are several just traces which are bad. This is one of them. So I can do a tau transition. Okay, so I can make a commitment to send A, and then I can send A. So the buyer can send A. Okay, and notice in sending in the buyer committing to receive A, I have interrupted the possibility of the regulator allowing the transition from this state to the state above to the state below. Okay, so this has been interrupted, this transition. And in fact, I could do this infinitely often. I can make this tau transition, and then I can perform this interaction A. And infinitely often, I can interrupt the regulator. Because I can infinitely often interrupt the interaction with the regulator, it doesn't need to happen. Only things that are not interrupted, they are obliged to happen in justness. So we have a just trace in which the regulator never is consulted. The seller and the buyer just go on forever with the product A. Okay, so that means that, of course, lock freedom with respect to justice does not hold, because we require in lock freedom, recall, that everyone can do something infinitely often if they want to. Okay. But on the other hand, lock freedom with respect to strong fairness of components does hold. Okay. Now, what does that mean, or why is that the case? Well, this is much more difficult to see. Well, we can see why that trace is ruled out. Remember this, we did this tau transition and then we performed A. Okay, but strong fairness of components is saying that if one component, the regulator, is infinitely often enabled to do one transaction, which is the interaction between C and C here, then eventually it will happen, which means that we will eventually take this transition from this state to this state, and the regulator will be consulted. And eventually, of course, this will mean we'll go back by the same reasoning, and in fact, all states of this, all of these transitions will eventually be covered. In fact, it's not true that all transitions will be covered, but certainly we will visit all states of the system. Okay. And in fact, this network is not well-typed, which is in line with LJ. So well-typedness seems to then, by this example, coincide with LJ in agreeing that this example should not be well-typed. Whereas if it coincided with SC, if we had completeness with respect to SC, that is, that anything that was that satisfies this property is well-typed, then this would be a counterexample to that particular claim. Okay, and the reason for this, why, this is incredibly complicated, and in fact, if I don't know whether you can look on the board behind me, but just in order to warm up for this particular presentation, I thought I'd try and figure out how complicated it is myself. And it is possible to draw what is called a high-level message sequence chart, where you have like choices and transitions to go on. But this high-level message sequence chart does not fit in the language of session types typically. And in session types, there's always a clarity about who makes a choice. And it should be the seller, because the seller is the person making the choice, whether they send A or B. But in fact, it's not entirely the seller that makes a choice about what the buyer is going to do. It's governance of choice. It's both the buyer and the regulator together that determine what action is going to happen. Okay, and so there's this confusion about who is making the choice, which is not expressible in the standard formalisms for session types. In fact, I'm not aware of any that would allow this. However, apparently there are more general notions of message sequence chart, high-level message sequence chart, which could be adapted to the setting. But that's very much, again, an open question. Like, can someone actually devise a session type system which will coincide with LSC rather than LJ? So the session type system we have in this work, and which is closely related to what is mostly studied in literature, we have shown that that's what this paper is, or this talk has been about, that we are living here. But it would be very interesting if it's possible to adapt to these examples by changing the session type system in such a way while retaining soundness and completeness in some sense. Okay, so this is showing that the problem is far from trivial. This is not at all an obvious example. Yet the automata itself is simple. I would say this is not a complicated automata. The analysis of it with respect to liveness properties and session types is highly non-trivial. Okay, so in conclusion, what we've done here, well, at the beginning, we considered this notion of the lock freedom, which was parameterized on all these possible notions of fairness that you see on the left. This was all the ones which are relevant for finite state communicating machines. We basically systematically argued why we were considering all of them at some level, okay, in order to filter out which notions of fairness are relevant to session types. And we found that only 4 exactly are relevant. And then we asked, well, which ones are the best match for session types? Which ones are satisfying some kind of notion or soundness and completeness? And it was very clear that the answer from this analysis, because we have this completeness result saying that anything satisfying lock freedom with respect to justness is typable, that lock freedom with respect to justness is a good candidate here. So the winner is of this particular exercise is the notion just lock freedom. This is a term that we propose for LJ. Instead of calling it LJ everywhere, that would be ambiguous. It is a nice naming convention for the paper. But in general, I think lock or just lock freedom is essentially the notion which we're looking for here. So this is a natural notion for distributed systems. Natural, since justness is like the minimal thing you can assume, but realistically you should assume it. And lock freedom is something that's natural for distributed systems, in that when you have more than 2 parties, you want to know that all the parties are staying alive to some extent, that they are still doing something. So I would say that this is not a contrived notion. This is something that comes out naturally if you think about the application domain as well, not just this theoretical analysis led us to the particular definition. Okay, so thank you very much for moderating, Nikolai.
Questions, please. Questions. Firstly, questions. Comments and suggestions later. Basically, I have a very naive question. May I ask a naive question?
Naive questions are often the best.
Okay. Recently, in artificial intelligence, people became concerned by fairness of artificial intelligence. But this concept is absolutely not relevant and absolutely different with concept of fairness in distributed systems or, well, in your talk. My naive question is methodological, basically. Should we suggest to avoid ambiguity in use of fairness? fairness in the artificial intelligence is very much unbiasedness.
Yeah.
So, what is your opinion about introducing new term without, well, let me say, in conflict, new term conflicting with previous meaning of a related term? For example, fairness in distributed systems, fairness in operating systems, and fairness in artificial intelligence.
Yes.
My concern is basically people in artificial intelligence usually are not aware about other fairness.
Yes. Okay. I think this is a reasonable question. And I would say, I would add to the confusion first by saying that there's this notion of fairness that you have in artificial intelligence to do with like the data sets you have and so on. And there's this notion of fairness that we have here, which is to do with how fairly choices are resolved, or non-determinism is resolved. And there are other notions of fairness, like there's fair exchange protocols, like whether like having completed the protocol, there's a fair kind of distribution of the knowledge or agreement between the parties involved. This is coming from security. So, and this creates confusion, particularly if you're in a security group, and these two notions are somehow used within the protocol analysis themselves, like, because in order to do a fair exchange protocol, maybe fairness in the sense of justness and so on is relevant. Discussing this just recently, I think it is. But they're very, very different notions. It's just like one is an assumption about the traces, and the other one is like a property that you're wanting to achieve between the parties in the system. In these particular conversations, I think you need to make it explicit. But then even if you make it explicit, because people are so used to like the notion of fairness they know, then people keep on falling back on the problems there. So to some extent, what I would do there in that situation is just point at a different part of the picture and use a different word to avoid the confusion if that conflict arises in such a situation, like in the analysis of security. And they therefore locally just resolve the problem. But I think between fairness in the sense of lock freedom and all these liveness properties due to Lamport, and fairness in the sense of AI, these things are so far apart, and they've evolved independently in their own literature, and it goes back a long way. I mean, it goes to like 70s or even earlier for when it comes to the notions of fairness that we have here. And I don't know about this fairness in the sense of AI, but I imagine it's just as old. When the culture is so deep, when it's going back, you're going back 50 years, then I think those two notions can retain their names. But it's more like when it starts to creep into the same application area. If you have a protocol and you're using fairness, the same word, to analyze two different things, then you need to make these notions very explicit, like what you mean.
Yep. My next question is, there is some question in chat, but let me first finish my question. You didn't mention any issues related to complexity, reasoning complexity.
Complexity.
Reasoning complexity.
Yes, I didn't say anything about complexity.
So it is nice that we have soundness and some kind of soundness, some kind of completeness, but well.
Yes, so what have you gained in terms of complexity? That's not my expertise. I would delegate that to someone else. For the type checking, typically you're looking for something with lower complexity, but of course there was a trade-off there. I needed to also make this assumption about race freedom. Yes, in order to get soundness and to get the properties. And so therefore, if you have race freedom, then the complexity of checking type checking should be lower than it is checking the property directly, but you are not covering the whole space. And if you want to cover all race-free processes, checking race freedom is almost as complex as probably the same complexity as checking as checking like the lock freedom property you wanted in the first place. So you can't then model check race freedom in order to get a complexity improvement. So what people do is they use syntactic approximations of race freedom. That's the standard in the session type literature, and that's why session types are more efficient. But we're not necessarily looking at complexity results here. That's why we've allowed a broader scope, and we've asked more semantical questions. Complexity, I think that would need a separate analysis. And it really is sensitive to really small things inside the definitions.
Well, it seems that there is some discussion between two Alexanders in the chat. Dear both Alexanders, would you like to share your discussion, and maybe Ross can comment somehow?
Well, the discussion is based basically on an observation. So if you happen to decide a generally undecidable problem, this means that you have done so for a subset of all the possible situations. And yeah, I mean, there are no miracles. So and that's why I started this discussion. My question is basically, what is the subset of the problems for which we are both sound and complete? And yeah, but
yes. Okay. So if in general, okay, because in general for an arbitrary system, you get undecidability. Then yes, and we're looking, in order to be able to check something efficiently, yes, you needed to restrict the system. That's absolutely right. Again, this is really dependent on the calculus. So it also depends on things like whether you're asynchronous or synchronous in terms of communication. So it happens that for the synchronous setting, so I make a choice what I'm going to send, but then synchronously we exchange that information. Okay, and there's no possibility I could send A, then send B, and then you can receive B before you receive A, which would be asynchronous. That's fully asynchronous, but you can also have message queues, and then you can still end up with reordering of messages. And when you start to have this asynchrony in the system with the presence of queues, then that's when things start to become really undecidable. Okay, and that's when the complexity problems become interesting. I think for this synchronous setting, already the complexity was not undecidable. That's the thing.
Okay, thank you. This is what I wanted to know.
But look at asynchronous stuff if you want the complexity. That's the most interesting frontier. Yes.
There is some comment from Nikolai Kudasov. Nikolai, would you like to read your comment yourself? Or maybe it doesn't matter right now, Nikolai?
It's just a response to the comment by Alexander that I mean, the type system can be sound and complete, but it doesn't mean that type checking in this type system is decidable. So you can actually have all well-typed term corresponds to all terminating terms or productive programs, but the type checking in your type system sometimes is undecidable. So you're moving just the halting problem to another part of the system.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a valid point. Thank you for making it.
So, more questions, suggestions, comments. If no more questions and suggestions, I just would like to thank Ross. Thank you very much indeed. Because, well, this in the spring semester, you are the first international speaker. Thank you very much.
So you haven't, so far it's always been within Russia.
Then, as you could see, we are indeed working seminar. We have discussions, we have questions. We are not professional in your topic, but nevertheless, We learned a lot. Thank you once again.
And
And
I think there's at least, sorry, I think there's at least one semi-professional going by the questions and the topic.
You're always welcome to join as a speaker and as a participant, listener. So thank you once again. It will be very nice of you to share your slides, to send me your slides. I will post them on our seminar webpage for further use.
Okay, большое спасибо.
Спасибо, до свидания. Thank you for speaking Russian.